Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another thing where I talk about things. Today, I would like to talk about game balance, and from a variety of perspectives actually. Game balance is one of these things that comes up in virtually anything that you get into, whether you're playing, football, or board games, or computer games, or things like that. But I think it's all kind of interesting, because there's a lot of different ways to approach game balance, and even more interesting is the way that players themselves perceive that balance and react to it. Now, I used to watch Extra Credits for a little while. I eventually kind of quit because I felt like they started to get away from their areas of expertise, and they started to kind of critique things that they clearly didn't know a lot about. They started talking about like Starcraft 2, and how Starcraft 2 was a fine example of what they called asymmetric balance. Some of the things that they said were somewhat accurate, but for the most part, Starcraft 2 is a really good example of a game that is not balanced very well at all. All players may have an equal chance of winning, but there's different types of balance, and Starcraft 2 fails on a lot of different fronts. Now, some games, you actually don't worry about this sort of thing very much. For example, I've got a board game called Betrayal at House on the Hill. Betrayal at House on the Hill is a game based on random chance, where you lay out a bunch of different tiles and then you draw cards. You never really know what you're going to get. And at the middle of the game, or late part of the game, whenever, if you don't roll your dice well enough, then someone becomes the traitor, and they're the bad guy, and usually they're trying to kill everybody else. But because of the randomness of the game, you never know if the traitor's going to have the advantage, or if all the other players are going to have the advantage. And it also depends on how many players you have, because some of the scenarios are set up differently depending on how many people that you have. This game is actually a lot of fun, because you spend a lot of time kind of trying to cooperate, but not cooperating too much because you don't know who it is who's going to stab you in the back. Not even the player who's going to stab you in the back, because even that is determined by a random dice roll. So the fun of the game kind of is about building up to this betrayal. And then the betrayal is sort of the climax of the game, and whether you win or lose, it's not that big of a deal because you had fun on the way there. But when you get into stuff like competitive online games, you find that people start to get a little bit more agitated. They're not so much there for the journey, they're there to beat other people. And they get really upset if your balance is really wonky. One of the more praised games for their balance is Starcraft, the original Starcraft. But that was one that was difficult to get into because the user interface required a lot of activity on behalf of the user. You had to be able to click a lot of things, you had to be very active. You got good at the game by having high actions per minute, as they called it. But there are newer games like Warcraft 3 for example, which are a little bit more accessible to people because the whole user interface is a little bit easier to manage. You've got smaller groups, the whole game is based more on micro. And this is a game that actually gets into what you call asymmetric balance, which is where you have one faction that's got different stats, different setup, different units, and they do different things. They perform differently at various parts of the game. For example, you would have the undead, and all of their units were a little bit more fragile, but they relied a lot more on magic powers, and so through their magical buffs and things like that, they would wind up being equal to the other faction's basic units. But of course, this game still built itself around a practical core. They had, your basic foot soldiers with their swords. They would go up to the front lines. They were your meat shields. Then you had your long-range units, and then you had your magic casters, and everybody had a way of filling in the same kind of roles. So although there was asymmetric balance, no particular faction really had things that nobody else had. With the exception of one thing, and this actually was a broken aspect of Warcraft 3, was that wind-walking orc. There was a character in Warcraft 3 who could turn invisible, and whenever he attacked a unit while he was not visible, he would do critical damage, which was basically like a one-hit kill on a worker unit. So what people would do is they would take this invisible unit, they would walk him into your base, and then use him to kill your workers, and then make him invisible again. He would run off, and then he would come back and he would kill your workers again. And so he would spend all game just killing off your workers and contributing nothing else. But it was so frustrating, and I hated playing against that so much that when I eventually said goodbye to Warcraft 3, when I said, okay, that's enough, I think I'm gonna quit playing this game, it was because I just couldn't bear the thought of logging in and playing against another skilled orc player with that stupid wind-walking orc. That was the most frustrating thing in the game. And a very prime example of a situation where you have balance, where everybody can play and everything is fair, but you've got some unbalanced ability that you could really just call it broken. Even if it's not tipping the scales in favor of the other guy, Warcraft 3 did not have a mechanic to where you could spot this orc. you just had to deal with it for the first like half of the game. I mean, like in the second half of the game, you got magical units or you got shades or things like that, which could see invisible units. But until then, this orc had free reign in your base because whenever it disappeared, it was gone. You know, broken, just kind of a broken unit. Not necessarily a game-winning unit, but just a really frustrating mechanic and a reason that I quit playing the game. Another game that you can look at that's got a more subtle approach to asymmetric balance is Forged Alliance Forever. It's a real-time strategy game, just like Warcraft 3. But this game takes a much gentler path towards asymmetric balance. Basically, everything is the same. Just like Warcraft 3, you've got all these different units, but they all kind of occupy the same role. But one faction has slightly tankier units, one faction has slightly faster moving units, but maybe they're a little bit more fragile. Another unit has like longer range or whatever. And that's kind of how they asymmetrically give everybody a little bit of faction flavor. So it's still fundamentally the same. I mean, if you just move the two units towards each other, you find that they kind of do about equally. Because, you know, although one unit survives for a little bit longer, it doesn't hit as hard or whatever. So they just kind of pan out and winds up a little bit closer to equal. Not perfectly, but close enough that most people don't complain too much. But there's a mod for Supreme Commander called Forged Alliance Forever, which has a bunch of updates and balance and things like that, and a ladder. And one thing that they did is they took this ability called the Chrono Dampener, and what the Chrono Dampener does is it every 5 seconds will just freeze units, and the units they'll stay frozen for 2 seconds. So what this does is this creates this really weird imbalance where units that rely on a high rate of fire to do damage, like units that have to be consistently firing, are severely gimped by this ability in the game. But units that fire once and then reload over 5 seconds are not impacted at all by this upgrade, making it just a broken, impractical upgrade that doesn't work. Against units that are affected by it, it's overpowered. Against units that are not affected by it, it's useless. As a consequence, almost nobody uses this power. And what was weird is I went on their forums and I tried to say that, you know, hey guys, this is kind of a broken ability. It should be tweaked and maybe modified. Maybe make it a late game thing, but have it always be on so that any units that come within range are shut down, you know, but because it's in the late game, you're still kind of more at risk. And what they told me is that because nobody was using it, it was in a fantastic balance state. Because if nobody was abusing it, then it was fine. Everything was great. So it's kind of like a squeaky wheel gets the grease sort of mentality. And you find this is true in a lot of games. Like, people don't complain about underpowered weaponry so much. If you play a game and there's a weapon that just sucks, then nobody uses it. And nobody complains about it because nobody's being destroyed by this horrible underpowered weapon. And that reaction was one of the reasons why I started thinking a lot about game balance from the perspective of players. And also from the perspective of developers, because whenever developers hear their players complaining about games, I can't help but wonder if they only hear about I mean, like, most people will gravitate towards the winning strategy. They want to win the game, so they go towards whatever's best. And in a lot of cases, you know, that leads to everyone to complain about the very best weapon in the game. And then what'll happen is if they nerf it too hard, they might find that the rest of the weapons in the game were not very well designed, and that was the only good weapon, which is why everybody was using it. It was like a crutch for the whole faction. So let's suppose that you've got like this RTS game, you know, or not an RTS game. Let's suppose you have a first-person shooter, right? Like a multiplayer first-person shooter. And one faction has like this one gun that everybody keeps going to. Everybody uses it, and it's a little bit overpowered. Like, let's say it's a little bit too accurate, people are getting headshots with it all the time, it's not doing too much damage per second, it's not really got too high of a rate of fire, but it's just very accurate. It's a little too easy to use, and players just keep going back to it. So as a game developer, you're going to see a lot of complaints from the other players saying like, man, every time I round a corner, I'm getting shot in the head by this gun. I hate this gun so much. So you go to nerf the gun, and you bring it in line with maybe all the other guns. And then you find out that your game is actually really badly designed because the overpowered gun was the only good gun in that faction's arsenal at all. And the trouble wasn't really that this one gun was, well, the gun was too good. But the fact was that you gave nobody any other alternatives. And so they really had no choice but to use this one overpowered weapon that you set up. And I find that this comes from things like when the devs are trying to get factional diversity, and they say to themselves, what should be a faction advantage? And another thing I've noticed is when playing PlanetSide 2, you see this a lot, where on the forums you see people talk about all the different factional advantages and disadvantages. There are 3 factions, and the factions have as advantages, the Terran Republic gets a high rate of fire on their guns, the New Conglomerate gets a high damage profile on their guns, their bullets do a lot of damage, and the Vanu Sovereignty, what they get is very high accuracy, or very low recoil, or very substantial mobility. Or sometimes they get accuracy and mobility, which if you combine the two, you realize, when you start thinking about it, you realize that sort of thing is kind of a double whammy. So you get this bizarre sort of thing where you go on the forums and you see people complaining, and a lot of them really hate fighting against the Vanu. Like, they don't like Vanu players, they don't like Vanu guns, but they can't put their fingers on it. They're not really sure why they dislike the Vanu so much. And the Vanu don't really get it either, because the Vanu are looking at their guns, and they're saying like, well, you know, we do less damage per second, we have a lower rate of fire, like, what do you think is so great about our guns that we're the overpowered faction? But all you have to do is just go to the VR room and you look at all the different guns. Like, you look at the TR gun, you fire off a few rounds into a practice target, and if you don't adjust for the recoil, or you find that the cone of fire might be much bigger, or maybe the recoil is more severe, and it takes more compensating to make the weapon be accurate. The same is especially true for the New Conglomerate guns. They have a lot of recoil. But then you get these Vanu guns, and the Vanu guns are all very accurate. You can kind of just, tag your target without a lot of control. You don't have to wrestle with the gun. It's a very accurate gun. This means that the gun is easier to learn. This means that new or less skilled players have an easier time with your weapons. This means that when you have 100 players online, all fighting over a small area, you've got more players who are having a better time with their weapon, and you get this cumulative faction-wide advantage where the Vanu wind up just in a better situation because they have better guns. Then consequently, everyone goes on the forums and they're just mad at the Vanu, and they don't really know why, because in small fights, in like a 10 vs 10 fight, everybody's fine, things seem okay, it doesn't seem like the Vanu are too great, but in these great big fights, you just can't seem to get any leverage on them. So, for game developers to balance something like that, I often feel sorry for them because they've done something wrong, and they're never going to be able to fix it. What they've done is they've created an advantage that it's basically they've made a gun a jack of all trades. Like, if you say that my faction's advantage is going to be accuracy, basically what you're doing is you're creating a gun that is going to be like reasonable at all ranges. Like, at close range, the high accuracy lets you shoot people in the head. And if the game gives you a bonus for that, well, then they're going to be killing more people because they're shooting in the head. At mid-range, they're more easily able to land their targets, they're going to do better. Long range, same thing. Accuracy is an advantage at every single range. And you just can't balance it. There's nothing that you can do. Because if you nerf their guns, if you make it to where their guns don't have as high of a DPS, you lower the DPS even further, then the guns are not competitive because they're multi-role weapons. So they're either going to be too good because they do everything, or they're going to be terrible because they're trying to do everything and can't do anything. They screw themselves. They make their faction's trait be we're the jack of all trades, and then they become too good at jack of all trades. Going back to Starcraft 2, this is why I feel like when Extra Credits did their thing and they got up and they said, Starcraft 2 is a fantastic example of asymmetrical balance, where everything is balanced perfectly. They got it wrong, because if you played that game, you realize that the factions were not actually balanced at all. They all kind of had equal chances of winning, but really more just due to design holes than it was due to them having all the tools to get the jobs done. One of the biggest problems that game faced on launch was that the Terrans were the only ones who could actually perform with any sort of versatility. The Terran Marine was the only unit that was just kind of an all-rounder, bread-and-butter infantry unit. If you looked at the Stalker in StarCraft 2, you saw that the Stalker had like a bonus to armor, it had this blink ability so it could do hit-and-run stuff, and to pay for that, they made the Stalker more fragile. So that way you had to constantly maneuver around, you had to choose your battles, you had to pick where you were going to engage from, you had to keep track, you had to micro more. And consequently, when the enemy attacked you, your Stalkers were worse on defense, because when you go on offense, you choose where you're attacking. So when you've got units that are very agile, very mobile, you attack where the enemy is weakest, and this is great. But when you have to go to defend, you go to where the enemy is, and they've chosen the ground for the fight. So Suddenly, the Stalker is not a bread and butter unit. The Stalker is a harassment unit. It has to be choosing its battles, and just toe-to-toe, it's not going to perform very well. So to make up for that, they had to add a bunch of band-aids into the Protoss arsenal. They gave them, like, force fields, which could block enemy movement, so they could throw down a force field on a ramp, and enemies couldn't come up the ramp. So that way the Protoss could just sit up there and be safe until they could get, like, some other unit that could actually defend against whatever push was coming their way. That was one thing they did. And when that wasn't good enough, then they had to add in, like, a special photon cannon that fired from your Nexus. Or, you know, it was something that just when the enemy attacked you, you know, you got one more base defense to help push the enemy out. Because their units, their Stalker, their basic bread and butter infantry, was not very good. It just wasn't a very good defensive unit. It was a great offensive unit, but it wasn't a core all-rounder unit like the Terran Marine is. And then you got in the Zerg, and the Zerg had it even worse, because the Zerg don't even get units that can shoot airplanes. Like, I mean, at least the Stalker can shoot air. Even if they're not really all that great at it, they could at least shoot air units, but the Zerg didn't get a unit that could even shoot air units. They got the Roach, and the Roach was like a short-range unit. It had better range than a Zergling. But what was frustrating was that because the Terrans had like a pretty average Marine, the Marines had a pretty average accuracy, you found that like blobs of Marines perform much better than blobs of Roaches. So the Roaches were kind of trying to offset this advantage by being tankier than Marines. But basically, the only thing that happened was that the Zerg just had to rely on being at an advantage in terms of resource income. And the game just has gotten to be very formulaic in the way that you have to approach everything, because you have two factions that really just don't have core infantry units, and you've got one faction that does. The game is not playable in a fun way throughout the entire duration of the game. And the ability to win swings wildly from period to period of the game. Like, everybody would always say that Faction A is strongest in the early game, Faction B is strongest in the mid game, Faction C is strongest in the late game, which means that the early and mid game would be incredibly stressful for Faction C, but the late game would be really hard for Faction, you know, B and A or whatever. So you go along and it's just sort of an unfun game. Not a very balanced game, a lot of units very broken, not very fun. It was actually a really poor example of asymmetric balance. It was asymmetric balance achieved in a statistical sense, but also done in a way that just freaking sucks for the players. And it's one of the reasons why a lot of people have kind of quit playing Starcraft 2. Starcraft 1 remains strong, actually developed an esports scene. I mean, you could make six figures playing the game in Korea, but Starcraft 2 is just kind of dropping off. People aren't really having very much fun. It's not very much fun to play. It's not very much fun to watch, and that's because they tried to go for this very strong sense of asymmetrical balance, and they did a really bad job of it. So one of the more interesting things, I think, about balance in video games, though, is just the subtlety behind trying to understand exactly where people go wrong, because sometimes it's so ingrained into the mechanics of the game that the game is just doomed from the start. Like StarCraft 2, doomed. They'll never be able to fix it because the game is built around hard counters, and the factions have already been designed to not have appropriate bread and butter infantry units. So it's already screwed. There's nothing they can do. I mean, they could completely overhaul the game, but that's such an unrealistic proposition. I mean, basically, the game should not have gotten out of beta until everything was well-rounded. But they launched before they had gotten functional infantry into every faction, and now they're screwed. There's not really a lot that they could do. Same goes for like PlanetSide 2. PlanetSide 2 is probably never going to be balanced because they're going to have to completely overhaul the entire Vanu faction and figure out a completely new faction advantage for them if they want that faction to be balanced. Because as it is, they're a good faction, and I mean, they're not overpowered, but they're certainly not underpowered, and they overperform in certain ways that are just really subtle and very difficult to work with. I mean, like like I say, you can't combine accuracy and mobility as a faction advantage and not realize what a double whammy that's going to be for the other players. The whole idea that, like, well, they're going to be harder to hit and they're going to have an easier time hitting you. And you just realize that, all right, their guns aren't stronger necessarily, but for goodness sake, they're going to be a lot harder to fight. So they, you know, I could be wrong, but I feel like I say, when you get just such a subtle sort of imbalance, it's incredibly difficult to rebalance, and you never know. You never know if a company can actually figure out how to do that. Of course, another one I was thinking of is I used to play a lot of Warhammer 40k, and this is one that everybody always complained wasn't balanced. And this is the most frustrating thing, I think, for developers, is that you can throw as many fun concepts into a game as you want, but the trouble is that if something is really great on paper, it doesn't always necessarily mean that it's going to be great in practice. So sometimes you get things like for example, in Warhammer there was a unit that could spawn other units. It was called the Tervagon, and it spawned these little Gaunt guys, these characters called Gaunts. And Gaunts were like, they're like some of the worst units in the game. So you could spawn these Gaunts, these awful units, and they would just get slaughtered in mass. But it looked really good on paper because you could say to yourself, like, oh, okay, I'll spawn these Gaunts, and I'll just have endless ways of Gaunts. But then when you got everything on the table, you realize that because they were such crappy units, they really didn't provide a lot for you. And the unit that spawned them was kind of very expensive and didn't do a lot of things, and it relied on this buff, and if they got outside of 12 inches of the main unit, then they were out of control, and they got easily swept in combat. And just all these things added up to make them be kind of terrible units, and it just didn't work. But Warhammer 40k, though, is notoriously unbalanced. That's one of those games where a lot of people think that they put the point costs on units that they want to sell to where they're a little bit better. I mean, like, one example was that they had a Space Marine Codex, and then they released a Space Wolf Space Marine Codex, which was just Space Marines, but with a wolf sort of theme. Like, everybody wore wolf hats, or they ran around with wolves. And what was really funny about that was that in Space Marines, the Space Marine Codex, vanilla Space Marines, all the Space Marines were 16 points each. In the Space Wolf Codex, all the Space Marines were 15 points each. 1 point difference. But the bigger your games got, the more that advantage accumulated. Because if you had 100 Marines, you saved 100 points, and that was enough for one more squad of guys. So you wound up with just a little bit more firepower on the table than the other guys. I mean, it added up. So, you know, there was like one more tank or whatever, because I think a tank was like 115 points. So, you know, you'd play Space Wolves, and you would get one free tank. You know, it was just an advantage. And it wasn't just that, too. If you played, like, for example, Devastators, where they're heavy units, and you played, like, you know, Heavy Bolters. Heavy Bolters were, like, 15 points for the vanilla Space Marines, but, like, 5 points for the Space Wolves. So, you know, so Space Wolves got a huge advantage there. I remember playing with a guy who was just, who actually, he quit showing up for a couple of weeks because he just got so disgusted. Like, I showed up with some Space Wolves, and he showed up with some vanilla Space Marines, and he's like, all right, I've got everyone decked out in plasma because I'm tired of fighting Space Marines. And I was like, oh, okay. So I stayed in cover, and then just took cover saves against all the plasma, and then with my significantly cheaper Heavy Bolters, I just wiped him off the table. And so he just packed up all this stuff, and he's just like, I hate this game. I hate the balance for this game. He's like, I'm not mad at you. He goes, because I wasn't even playing like a really cruel list, but I showed up with like this really fluffy, like, I was like, oh yeah, you know, like, I've got all these units that are like, everyone tells me not to take them, but I wanted to take them because they have wonky psychology rules, and I just thought that would be interesting, you know. So I was like playing like that, and so the guy was like, oh, okay, you know, it looks like a pretty fluffy list. I don't mind. I've got a pretty fluffy list here. This is my anti-marine list. Do you mind if I pull my anti-marine list on your marine army? And I was like, nah, it's fine, it's fine. So yeah, I annihilated him, and then he was just pissed because he was like, that was my anti your guys list, and you crushed him. Like, it was like there was no winning. And I was like, sorry about that. You know, I didn't know what to say. I mean, like, I occasionally went to dinner with those guys. They were nice guys, you know. So balance, you know, bad balance can ruin a game. If you're statistically balanced, but you have really bad asymmetrical balance, it can ruin a game. If your game is great on most fronts, but you have one unit like the Windwalking Orc, it may not ruin the game, but for people like myself, one day you just quit playing. And the thing about it was, like, I quit playing Warcraft 3, and whenever I went back to it, I went to go click on the random match thing, and I would stop, and I would think to myself, like, what if I bump into an orc player, and he tries to play the Windwalking Orc? I don't want to play against the Windwalking Orc, and I just wouldn't do it. I just didn't want to play against that character. I hated that character. I hated that mechanic. It made the game frustrating. It wasn't a lot of fun to play against. That sort of thing can ruin your game. I mean, it's tough. It's very difficult, and a lot of people get very angry with game developers if they don't get it right. But I think it's an absurdly difficult thing to get right. I mean, there's so many different variables to account for, and it's a big reason why you don't see a lot of real-time strategy games, because the amount of careful consideration that goes into balancing that sort of thing, it's virtually impossible. I mean, I almost have to laugh at the fact that the Dawn of War series included like 8 playable factions, and that game was not balanced. I mean, like, when you play that game, you just have to play it for laughs, because you're just like, yeah, big bombastic explosions, oh, that is overpowered. Wow. But, you know, they were never going to balance 8 factions. There's just too many different factors, you know, too many different loose ends. Your players are going to come up with creative ways to abuse your system. And of course, you know, you just can't do it. There's nothing you can do. So, you know. But anyway, those are my thoughts on game balance. Like I said, kind of an interesting subject. And I suppose that's it. I'll catch you guys next time.